In this video, I'm going to talk about kind of an overview of photosynthesis, and then I will also post some additional videos that go into a little bit more detail about some of the reactions involved in photosynthesis. So to start out, let's take a look at kind of this overall equation of what is happening during photosynthesis. So during photosynthesis, plants and some other organisms, including algae and some cyanobacteria, can do this reaction known as photosynthesis. And in doing so, these organisms can take carbon dioxide, which we can abbreviate as CO2, and water, which we can abbreviate as H2O, and then using energy from the sun, we can make carbohydrates and oxygen. Now, I use this CH2O as kind of a placeholder for carbohydrates because photosynthesis makes a molecule that can then be converted into different types of carbohydrates. Another way that we could write this equation is if we were to take a look at this equation happening 6 times. So if we say times 6, what we would end up with is 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules being used with solar energy as a catalyst to form the carbohydrate specifically known as glucose, which would be C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen. So you may be more familiar with this bottom equation, but both of these equations really show you photosynthesis. The first one's just a little bit more simplified. The second one just shows you what happens after photosynthesis has gone through kind of multiple rounds of reactions to actually produce glucose. But we'll talk about how this kind of generic carbohydrate that we can see in this first equation, we'll talk a little bit later about how plants can actually convert that molecule into other carbohydrates, as well as things like amino acids and lipids, in order to make other macromolecules as well. In another video, you should have learned about redox reactions, but we'll do a quick review of those reactions here because they play an important role in photosynthesis. So remember that redox is actually an abbreviation for reduction and oxidation. And remember that we can use the mnemonic of oil, rig to remember what is happening during these reactions. So in an oxidation reaction, an atom or a molecule is going to lose an electron. So we remember oxidation is loss of electrons. A reduction reaction is a gain of electrons. So an atom or a molecule is going to gain an electron when it is reduced. Also, as a reminder, in chemical reactions involving compounds that have covalent bonds, in addition to electrons, hydrogen is also typically being transferred. So we often refer to or write out these redox reactions as the electrons, standing for E negative, plus some hydrogen ions. So the E negative refers to electrons being transferred, and H plus stands for hydrogen ions. So if we write out our photosynthesis reaction, if we look at our overall reaction, so let's take a look at our 6 carbon dioxide molecules, our 6 water molecules. Remember, we get some solar energy as a catalyst, And then we produce glucose, which is C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of oxygen. And this reaction right here actually demonstrates a redox reaction. So in doing so, the carbon dioxide gets reduced to form the glucose. And you can actually see that with the addition of this hydrogen here. So this is a reduction reaction. Whereas the water gets oxidized in order to form the oxygen. All right, so the carbon dioxide goes through a series of these reactions, and in the process, it's going to gain some electrons and hydrogen ions. Meanwhile, the water is going to be oxidized, so it is going to lose some electrons and lose those hydrogen ions. So we can kind of show that we're losing both of those, whereas here we are gaining both of those. Now, in this arrow, I actually want to put a couple of smaller arrows in here because there are actually several chemical reactions that are happening between the left side and the right side of the arrow. So really, this equation that I've written out is very simplified, and it's only showing you the absolute starting reactants and the kind of the end products that we get at the very end of photosynthesis. But there are actually probably dozens of reactions that happen between the left side of this arrow and the right side of this arrow. And those redox reactions are happening along the way. Now, as we talk about some of these reactions in more detail, and especially go into these redox reactions, we're going to refer to a chemical that we abbreviate as NADP+. All right, and so this is just the abbreviation of this really long chemical name. You don't need to know the full name of the chemical for the sake of this class. You just need to know that it's NADP+. And NADP plus is something that can act as an electron carrier. So essentially what happens is it can pick up electrons and hydrogen ions. And in doing so, it forms another molecule known as NADPH. And whenever I write out NADPH, I like to put two little circles here. And these circles are standing for those electrons that were picked up by NADP+. So those circles indicate electrons. So when NADP plus gains electrons, remember reduction is a gain of electrons. So the forward arrow of this reaction is going to be a reduction reaction because NADP plus gains electrons. And those electrons get held by NADPH. And NADPH we can call an electron carrier, because it kind of acts as this intermediate molecule that helps to transfer or carry electrons from one molecule to another molecule. And so we'll talk about when during photosynthesis NADPH is formed, and then we're also going to talk about the opposite reaction. So we can put an opposite arrow here because this reaction is reversible. And when NADPH gets to the molecule that it needs to give the electrons to, it becomes oxidized. So it goes through an oxidation reaction in order to lose those electrons to reform NADP+. So in summary, it's just important to note that oxidation and reduction reactions typically occur together because the electrons that are removed from one atom or molecule have to go somewhere. And so when one atom or molecule is oxidized and loses those electrons, then another atom or molecule is reduced by gaining those electrons. And generally speaking, there are these redox reactions that happen during photosynthesis. And we'll be talking about NADP plus as a molecule that can pick up electrons, transport it to somewhere else, and then give up those electrons to another molecule as kind of an intermediate of these redox reactions. So we can take the dozens of reactions of photosynthesis and kind of break them down into two different kind of groups or types of reaction. So the first type are what we call the light reactions. And they're called this because they directly need light, which is solar energy, in order to occur. So directly requires light, which is solar energy from the sun, to occur. And essentially what happens during the light reactions is that solar energy gets converted to a different kind of energy. So solar energy from the sun gets converted to chemical energy. And that chemical energy is stored in the bonds of molecules such as ATP and NADPH. Now, the second group of reactions are known as the Calvin cycle. And I have also seen these referred to as the dark reactions or the light independent reactions. But these terms, the dark reactions and the light independent reactions, are not very good at really describing what's happening because the light reactions have to happen before the Calvin cycle can occur. So they're not really light independent because they're dependent on the light reactions or the products of the light reactions in order to occur. And calling it a dark reaction is not really very descriptive either because these reactions can occur when the sun is out or they can occur in the dark. So the Calvin cycle kind of tells you a little bit more about it being a cycle. And essentially what happens in the Calvin cycle is that the products from the light reactions, so the chemical energy stored in the molecules of ATP and NADPH during the light reactions, gets converted to a different kind of chemical energy. This time, it's stored in the chemical energy of carbohydrates. And in another video, we'll go over more of the details of the reactions that occur, where they occur in the plant, what happens to convert this energy from one form to another, et cetera, et cetera. Before we get too much into the reactions of photosynthesis, let's do a little review of plant cells and their structures that are involved in photosynthesis. So as a reminder, plant cells have a cell membrane that is surrounded by a cell wall. Inside the cell, in addition to things like a vacuole and ribosomes and a nucleus, et cetera, there are these kind of oval-shaped green structures called chloroplasts. And these chloroplasts are where the reactions of photosynthesis occur. So if we were to take a closer look at a chloroplast, so if we were to take one and kind of zoom into it, let's take a look at what it would look like. So what this chloroplast would look like, and I'll kind of draw it over here, and then I'll kind of zoom in and draw it over to the side as well. But first of all, there is a double plasma membrane that kind of surrounds or makes up the boundary of the outside of the chloroplast. And then inside the chloroplast, there are additional structures that are surrounded by plasma membranes. And these structures are kind of like a flattened disc, and they're called thylakoids. So once again, when we say membrane bound, we're talking about that plasma membrane, similar in structure to the cell membrane. So we're talking about a phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins often. So once again, if I were to kind of zoom into a chloroplast and draw it over here. So the chloroplast would have this double membrane here. And if we were to zoom into a bit of this double membrane here, once again, we would see that phospholipid bilayer. And because it's a double membrane, we would actually have two layers of phospholipid bilayer actually stacked on top of each other. So this right here would actually just be the one membrane. The other membrane would actually be kind of stacked underneath it. And so this phospholipid bilayer would be the inner membrane here. Now, inside the chloroplast, we have these stacks, and these are called thylakoids. And once again, these thylakoids are also made up of this phospholipid bilayer. So if you were to zoom into a section of the membrane here, you would see something that looks very similar to the cell membrane with this phospholipid bilayer. So this whole structure here is actually the thylakoid, and then the edge or the membrane is called the thylakoid membrane. The space inside the thylakoid is called the lumen. So we can call it the thylakoid space, or we'll see this word quite a bit in biology. Lumen just means the space that is kind of surrounded by something else. And then a stack of thylakoids together is called a granum. And if we're talking about multiple stacks, so in this picture here, I actually have two stacks of thylakoids. So multiple stacks would be called grana. So granum is one stack of thylakoids. Grana is two or more stacks of thylakoids. In addition to the thylakoids, outside the thylakoids, but still contained within the double membrane of the chloroplast itself, we actually have a liquid, and I'll just draw some little waves here to stand for this liquid or aqueous solution. And this liquid area here is called the stroma. Now, one reason why we are spending so much time talking about the structure of a chloroplast, because this is where the reactions of photosynthesis occur. The light reactions actually happen in the thylakoid membrane. So embedded in this thylakoid membrane, there are actually these proteins that we'll talk about a little bit more. And these proteins are involved in those light reactions, with some materials being transported from the thylakoid space or lumen out to the stroma, or from the stroma into the thylakoid space. Now, the stroma itself is the site of the Calvin cycle. So the products of the light reactions get transported into the stroma where they are then used for the Calvin cycle.